A knock on the door that night snapped him out of dark fantasies of revenge and agonizing thoughts of the future that could have been. Not that his reality was any better. His life was in chaos, and his dreams were shattered. And yet life went on. Kenny opened the door of his apartment and stared at it. She was completely soaked from the rain and looked like a drowned rat. Her visit was not unexpected, and he had expected it before. Her life and that of her sister and father had been turned upside down. It had been a month since he had dated his ex-wife. There had been such a whirlwind of events since then that he struggled to keep them in his head. They were like demons escaping from Pandora's box. He'd opened that box when he'd told Leslie that he knew about her affair and that their marriage had broken up. The nightmare of their confrontation was forever etched in his memory. He didn't let her speak that night because there was nothing she could say that would make a difference. She had cheated on him many times and she wasn't going to stop. There were no words that could help soothe the burn of what she'd said to Jerry, or how much she'd enjoyed their affair, even if the sex hadn't been entirely satisfying for either of them. It was a game to them. The fact that her brother-in-law was with her and that it was such a passionless affair still puzzled him. She had slept with her older sister's husband and had simply given up their marriage because she could. She'd even promised her cheating buddy that he could take up with her again after she got Kenny pregnant. That was the final blow, a dagger to Kenny's heart. Even before this, Kenny had been willing to try to save the marriage, but after learning of his wife's simple, heartless expectation to continue cheating on him, his marriage was dead. Kenny looked at his visitor and felt his heart break. Mascara was dripping down her cheeks, mixed with tears, and it made her look like a pitiful raccoon. She looked so alone, hidden in her pain and confusion. She looked up at him with pleading eyes, begging for respite from her torment. He held out his hand, and she threw herself into his embrace. "Shh," he whispered softly in her ear as she sobbed. "I was told this nightmare would end. Someday soon, I hope." She clung to him and sobbed like a little girl who had lost her favorite pet. Still clinging tightly to his chest, Kenny led her into the apartment and closed the door. "Why?" she mumbled through her tears. "Why? Ia," he said softly. "I don't know why." He felt her shake her head slowly as her crying subsided. She looked up at him and stared intently into his eyes. "No, it's not that," she whispered hoarsely. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kenny looked at his sister-in-law again. He wiped away some of her tears before taking care of a few of his own. "Jill, I couldn't," he finally squeezed out, his voice choppy with worry. "I couldn't hurt you like that. You didn't deserve it." "But neither do you." "No, but we're still here." He went to the bathroom and brought her a towel. Smiling sadly, he held it out to her. "I feel like such a fool," she said softly. "Not even 3 weeks ago I was here begging you to give my sister another chance. I'm so sorry, Kenny, I didn't know. Les was hysterical after you left her. It was a whole day before Dad could get anything from her. She said you two had a fight, and she said and did some things that made you leave. It wasn't until the next week that Father heard differently. One of his lodge brothers informed him that they had heard from one of your friends that Les had cheated on you. When Father confronted her, Les confessed to the affair. She never gave details and never mentioned who her affair was with." Kenny took a deep breath. He knew that Leslie had never told anyone about Jerry. For the first 2 weeks, she had tried to call and talk to him often, but Kenny had simply hung up and blocked her number. After several failed attempts to physically confront him, Kenny sent a copy of his tape with a few pictures. Leslie panicked and cornered him in the parking lot near work. It was ugly. "Stay away from me, you cheating whore!" he yelled loud enough for everyone to hear. She ran to her car in tears. She stayed away from him after that. He figured she hoped that way her secret would stay hidden longer. Kenny figured too many people knew, so the truth would eventually come out. Jill's dismissive snort brought his attention back to his frail sister-in-law. She looked like she'd eaten something that tasted really bad. 2 days after her confession, the older sister came to try to talk to you and plead with you. I already knew it would be a waste of time. You had already spoken to your father and told him there would be no reconciliation. Jerry said you told him the same thing when he talked to you. She stopped and looked at him. "He never talked to you, did he?" she asked, wiping away her tears. Kenny shook his head. "That's what I thought when Dad told me about him and Les. Damn him. Now I have to question everything he ever said to me." "Do you know that my heart really broke for my sister in those first weeks?" she said quietly, holding back tears. "My heart was breaking for you too, but her pain was right in front of me. I knew it was her fault, but seeing her in such agony and despair, I prayed that there was some way to forgive her. Now I hope she suffers every day. I guess that makes me a bad person, right?" "No," Kenny replied softly, "just deeply hurt. I won't tell you I don't feel the same way. I hope she's hurting too. I don't feel the pain and rage anymore like I did when I found out, but they're still here. I hope someday I can get over it, but the scar will stay forever." "How could they do this to us?" she whispered. Then she snuggled into his chest again and cried quietly. After a few minutes, she stood still. Then in a very quiet voice she spoke. "You know, you could have told me. It would have been better to hear it from you than to find out the way I found out. I'm sorry, Jill, but there's no better way to find out that someone you love has betrayed you. And worse, they betrayed you with someone you loved and trusted in your own family. Besides, I knew you would find out soon enough. Too many people knew about it to hide it for long. I figured many of our friends knew why we had broken up so quickly. Then other things happened, even more obvious. After all, how did you find out?" "My father told me. It almost killed him, but in the end he was able to do it." "That makes sense. Your father was always smart. I knew after our run-in with Jerry at the lodge he'd figure it out." "Run-in?" She snorted and wiped her nose with her sleeve. "Dad said it was more like a kick in the ass." "Well," he smiled. "Well, that bastard definitely deserved it," she said, still trying to wipe herself. "Kenny, do you happen to have anything dry that I could wear?" "I'll find something, but it'll probably be too big." "I don't mind as long as it's dry." He found her his sweatpants, socks, and sweatshirt. She graciously took them, threw the towel on a chair, and went to change in the bathroom. While she changed, Kenny leaned back in his chair and remembered his one and only meeting with his future son-in-law. Jerry had recently been invited to join the lodge again. He had declined a couple of invitations in the past, and now Kenny thought he knew why. It was obvious that screwing his daughter-in-law was more important than trying to impress his father-in-law. After the run-in with Les, Kenny wanted to minimize any further contact with either of them, so he had asked to withdraw Jerry's invitation for personal reasons. He refused to give details to the membership committee, but informed them that if Jerry joined, he would resign. Jerry's invitation was quietly withdrawn. When Bert broke the news to him, Jerry did not take it well. He confronted Kenny at the next lodge meeting. Kenny wasn't sure if it was Jerry's arrogance or stupidity that caused his son-in-law to publicly confront him at the weekly meeting. He figured that Jerry clearly didn't think he would reveal his role in Kenny and Leslie's divorce. He was wrong. Jerry began yelling at Kenny and making a scene. He accused Kenny of taking his divorce out on the rest of the family. When Kenny turned to leave, Jerry made the mistake of grabbing his arm. The rest was like a blur in Kenny's mind. Kenny's response was swift and angry. He remembered hitting Jerry several times and even yelling, "69, it's you, you piece of shit." Kenny even had a vague memory of being dragged off a bloody Jerry lying helplessly on the floor. Of course, Kenny was still able to land a few blows to Jerry's balls before he was dragged off completely. Naturally, his father-in-law witnessed the whole thing. He wasn't surprised that Bert had figured it out so quickly. What did surprise him was that he had never been arrested. In fact, the police never visited him once after one of his lodge brothers drove him home. "You know he was in the hospital for 3 days, Jill's soft voice said, bringing him back from his reverie. I said Jerry was in the hospital for a few days. They thought he was going to lose one of his testicles." "Too bad he didn't. I'm surprised I've never been questioned by the police." "Why would they do that?" she asked, grinning understandingly. "Dad said Jerry was robbed outside the gatehouse and there were several witnesses." Kenny looked embarrassed. She tried to smile sweetly back at him. She was wearing his sweatpants, and they were so big she was getting lost in them. She looked like a little girl playing dress-up. Dad told me that after you left, my pig husband came to his senses and wanted to call the police. In response, Dad kicked him in the balls a couple more times. When Jerry came to his senses, Dad told him that several of the Lodge brothers had seen him get mugged in the parking lot. Dad told him that after he was discharged from the hospital, he'd better run. He warned him that he better not involve the police or the Lodge brothers would come after him. Apparently, Jerry believed him since he moved out yesterday. That's when Dad told me who my little sister cheated on you with. Jill cried again. Kenny put his arms around her and pulled her against him. She was warm, and he could feel her soft body pressed against him. His thoughts filled with the fantasy of carrying her to his bed. It wouldn't be revenge sex, at least not for him. Jill was a very special woman. She was kind and generous, the best Kenny had ever known. She wasn't as pretty as Leslie, but she had an inner beauty that more than made up for it all. Kenny knew he loved her, but not the way he had once loved Leslie. Still, if they ended up in bed together, it wouldn't be sex, but lovemaking. That's right. Take advantage of someone you love who is vulnerable and suffering. Hell of a way to show her how much you respect her. Maybe we'll meet someday, but not now with all this going on. Kenny sighed, realizing that any future relationship with his sister-in-law was very unlikely. There would be too many memories and too much baggage. Soon, Jill was crying and silently allowed him to hold her in his arms. He felt her take a deep breath and felt her instinctively pull him tighter against her. Suddenly, she let go of him and took a small step back. She looked up into his face with surprise and embarrassment. He laughed softly and assured her that everything was fine. After giving her a chance to collect herself, he reached out and grabbed her discarded towel. "I must look terrible," she said, taking it from him. "Yes," he replied, smiling even wider, "but it was a beautiful mess." She snorted and quickly covered her mouth with her hand. They both laughed. "But not as pretty as my sister, right?" she asked quietly. "Jill, No, Kenny," she said firmly. "I know what I am. I'm a cheating wife whose husband had an affair with her prettier younger sister. I'm just a jaded, childless housewife, exhausted and not yet 35 years old." "Bullshit," he snapped. "You're one of the most incredible women I've ever met. It's not your fault. It's our fault we married such pathetic spouses." "Jill, I know for a fact that you're feeling rejected right now. It haunts me too. But you are something special. You're giving, and I know you feel empty right now, but you're not. Even if Jerry was too blind to see you, there are plenty of other men who will. Many probably already do." "I feel like I wasted so many years on Jerry," she said sadly. "Kenny, you know we haven't had kids yet because Jerry said he wasn't ready?" He nodded again. "Damn, I feel like a fool," she said with a chuckle. "I feel like I wasted my youth for this ass." Kenny couldn't shake the thought that he'd married the wrong sister. The thought had crossed his mind more than once over the past month. He slowly shook his head with regret. "Hang in there, beautiful," he encouraged her gently. "There'll be a whole line of guys wanting to ask you out before this is over." "Do you really think so?" she whispered. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better?" "Well, I really hope it makes you feel better, but it's still the truth." "Jill, think about it. Are you an attractive divorced woman of 30 with a heart of gold? You're priceless." This time, she slowly stepped into his arms and snuggled into his chest again. Through her quiet sobs, he could occasionally make out a muffled, "Thank you." "Of course," he said softly, leaving the thought hanging in the air. She gave him a quick, anxious glance. She gazed into his eyes, looking for a hint of what he was about to say. "Of course," he continued to smirk. "You need to get rid of the drowned raccoon image." Her laughter was like a soothing balm for his own wounds. They clung to each other like two wounded souls nestled together. Each found safety and comfort in the arms of the one who loved them. They say time runs away, and Kenny made sure it was true. Sometimes it went slow, sometimes fast, but most of the time it seemed to go with him. When her and Jerry's secret was revealed, it didn't take Leslie long to change her tactics toward Kenny. Gone was the fear that her family and friends would find out what had happened. Most either suspected or knew the reason for the divorce, so there was no reason not to chase after Kenny. It was immediately clear that this was a bad tactic. With each attempt to get involved, Kenny's responses got uglier and louder. Soon Leslie was languishing in a hell of her own making. Losing Kenny was devastating, but she knew she was the one who had left him. She knew she was also guilty of betraying her own sister. Guilt and remorse overwhelmed her. She was at a loss trying to find a way to begin to repair this relationship. At first, she began to fight the divorce, but due to the lack of support from family and friends, she soon realized it was futile. Her despair and hopelessness began to turn into frustration. Kenny still kept in contact with Jill, and they spent many nights with one or both of them crying on the other's shoulders. Jill was the only person Kenny could talk to about Leslie. Partly because Jill needed someone to talk to, and Leslie's betrayal had devastated her almost as much as Jerry's had. On the other hand, he needed someone to talk to too, and Jill knew the pain he was feeling. Jill informed Kenny that Leslie had apologized to her at least a dozen times since their affair had been revealed. Kenny didn't ask, but Jill relayed to him some of the excuses her younger sister had made. Basically, Leslie said she'd acted like a spoiled bitch. She had cheated with Jerry because she wanted what Jill wanted and never thought Kenny would ever leave her. After that first time, it was the excitement of the forbidden fruit of them. Jill said she accepted Leslie's apology, but told her they were no longer sisters. That relationship was dead. There was very little communication between them now. She also told him that Jerry had moved on, but was constantly calling her trying to repair the relationship. Jerry said the same thing he told Leslie. He never thought Jill would leave him. Even with the proof Kenny gave her, Jill said she was still torn and wasn't sure she could survive the divorce. She still loved Jerry, and the thought of being alone terrified her. However, there was no way she could accept that he was having an affair with her sister. At the time, she still refused to reconcile. This whole situation was devastating to their father. Bert tried to support both of his daughters, but Leslie's betrayal of her sister was impossible to forget. He decided to help Jill, but try not to neglect Leslie. It was far from ideal, but it worked almost every day. Bert and Kenny talked regularly too. It usually took place in the lodge every week. Bert tried not to talk much about Leslie, but focused mostly on Jill. Both men were concerned that she might actually go back to Jerry back. A few weeks later, Kenny was surprised when Bert informed him that Jerry had signed the divorce papers and disappeared. When his father-in-law described to him the circumstances surrounding Jerry's decision, Kenny couldn't keep from laughing. "You're kidding, right?" Kenny said, holding his aching sides. "I am," Bert smiled. "How could you really pull that off?" "Well, if you're lucky," laughed his father-in-law. "That, and let's face it, we weren't dealing with the guy who was ever considered the sharpest tool in the shed." Both grinned as they heard Bert describe Jerry. Kenny had heard that Jerry had moved into the Hideaway Motel on 5th Avenue after he got out of the hospital. No wonder he was staying in room 69. Well, that's where he usually stayed. Even with that, Kenny smirked, it took some serious thought. "Not really. One of our lodge brothers is the uncle of the man who owns the Hideaway Motel. As long as we paid for any damage and didn't hurt him too much, he was fine. Of course, someone slipped him a few hundred as well. Once we gained access to his room, we made sure the deadbolt wasn't working and waited for him to fall asleep. We used the spare key to get in and made sure we locked the door again as we left. We were all overdressed, but our leader was dressed special." Bert couldn't help himself and laughed again. "Kenny, do you remember James Gibson? He's a lodge brother from our Miami chapter." Kenny nodded. He'd only met him twice, but Mr. Gibson was definitely memorable to him. A big 6.5-foot tall, muscular, dark-skinned, balding man who tended to draw attention to himself. Those who knew James disregarded his intimidating appearance and knew he was a good-natured man with a wicked sense of humor. "Well, I negotiated a couple of favors and brought him back that weekend. Heck, Kenny, when James dressed up like a voodoo priest with his face painted on his skull, he scared the hell out of us all, and we knew who he was. I can't imagine what Jerry thought when he woke up with 4 hooded men holding him down and gagging him. And then to have James draw fake voodoo signs on his bare chest with chicken feet and blood? Bert howled with delight. Then, said Bert, trying to catch his breath. James muttered some fake Jamaican swear word. Damn it, Kenny, I've never seen a man's eyes pop out of his orbits like my pathetic son-in-law that night. James warned him not to go to the police or he would wake up castrated one morning. He warned him to sign the papers and get out of town before dawn, or the curse he had just put on him would eat his arms and legs. I can't believe it worked. Kenny smiled, shaking his head. Well, we planned a few more things to play on his superstitions, but our one visit should have been enough. Jerry was gone before the morning sun even touched the door of his motel room. Like I said, nobody ever claimed to be the smartest. All we had to pay for was extra cleaning in his room. Well, that and replacing the mattress on the bed, since Jerry was covered in crap. Both men laughed until they had to brush away a tear or two. Kenny thanked his father-in-law but was told that it wasn't just for him. Kenny admitted that it made him feel good to know that others were looking out for Jill. Kenny spent the next month focusing on work and avoiding Leslie. Her calls and meetings stopped. What was even more disconcerting was that she was getting angrier and angrier as their divorce went through the courts. Kenny was distracted from his duties at the lodge. One of his duties was to interview potential fellows of the lodge. That's why Kenny found himself on the outskirts of town that day. It was mostly a formality, but he was to interview an 18-year-old high school senior named Samantha. The lodge had chosen her for one of their scholarships, and he was conducting his final interview with her. Although it was mostly a formality, Kenny needed to make sure everything on her application was legitimate. He met with her at a cafe owned by her family. According to her application and previous phone interviews, she had been raised by her grandparents after her mother ran away. Her grandparents owned the cafe until their deaths, which occurred 2 years ago. After their deaths, Sam's Aunt Amanda returned to the neighborhood and took over the cafe and the upbringing of the teenager. Since then, Sam had lived with her aunt in their family home outside of town and worked at the cafe. They didn't starve, but the money to send Sam to college was clearly not enough. The girl's grades had been outstanding up until the death of her grandparents, but she had suffered greatly after that. She had only recently begun to pull up her grades. The lodge's scholarship will help cover the cost of tuition at a local college. It would help her get a fresh start. That was something Kenny could easily agree with. When Kenny had talked to Sam before, he had realized that she was a pretty impressive young lady. She was polite, but certainly bold, and had a very attractive personality. She was funny and very flirtatious. Plus, she appeared more mature than he expected from a girl her age. Upon entering the cafe, he recognized her immediately, even though he had never met her before. Her laughter and smile filled the room. She hopped from one table to another, making sure each customer had what they needed. They had agreed to meet after lunch, but a few customers were still lingering. She greeted him with a wide, toothy smile, and they sat in a corner booth, away from everyone. Kenny was taken by a girl. Aside from her delightful personality, she was quite attractive. She appeared taller than he had imagined. He guessed she was about 5 feet 10 inches tall. She had curly hair the color of a crow's wing and sparkling green eyes. She had a supple young body, but there were curves that hinted that she had quite an attractive figure when she got older. They talked for a few more minutes while Sam confirmed her interests and information. Her grandparents had died in an automobile accident, and her aunt had come home from Florida. She and Aunt Amanda had gotten along great and had grown even closer after the loss. When Kenny asked if she needed to go back to work, she assured him that her aunt had told her that she had her back. Kenny noticed a dark-haired, stocky woman behind the counter with a warm smile. He was a little surprised as the woman didn't look much like Sam and looked older than he expected. He remembered Sam saying that her aunt was her mother's younger sister. In fact, he thought she must be only 6 or 7 years older than the teenager. The woman behind the counter looked like she was well past 40. Kenny didn't have time to ask this before he heard some noise behind him. Turning, he stared at Leslie, who was racing toward them with fire in her eyes. "You hypocritical bastard!" Leslie shrieked. "Is that why you won't even talk to me and try to work on our marriage? You couldn't even wait until the divorce was finalized before you replaced me with this girl? What were you doing, scouring the high schools to find her? Kenny felt the blood rush to his face as his anger began to boil over. Before he could respond, however, he was interrupted by Sam's overdramatic sigh. "Oh my God!" she shrieked in a mocking, girlish voice. "You mean me and him? I mean like, he's so old. I mean how, he must be 30. Kenny looked at Sam and saw the glint in her eyes. He suppressed a smirk. Her absent-mindedness helped him deal with his anger. He turned to Leslie and answered in a cold, subdued voice. "Les, this is Samantha, one of this year's scholarship recipients." He watched as all of Leslie's rage began to deflate like a balloon. Trembling slightly, she leaned one hand on the table. Yeah, she stammered. "Yes, I know," he interrupted. "You're sorry, but like I said, it won't fix anything. The reason I'm not fighting for our marriage is because he's dead. You killed him by deceiving me, and you betrayed not only me, you slept with your own son-in-law." He heard both women aghast. He looked at Sam and saw that all playfulness was gone from her eyes. In its place was something more akin to pity. The thought made Kenny's stomach twist, and the anger he'd been holding back burst out. He turned to Leslie again, and the look he threw at her made her recoil. There was no love or kindness for her. "And to answer a few of your other questions," he simmered, "I'd have to go to an elementary school to find someone as selfish and shallow as you. I'd be hard-pressed to find a supposed loving spouse who would destroy their own marriage and that of their brother and sister just because she could." "You're right," Leslie said, and tears ran down her cheeks. "I've been a selfish bitch. There's no excuse for what I did. But Kenny, I can change. Please don't do this to us. I love you." "Do you love me? Love me?" yelled Kenny. "You've got to be kidding me, right? Tell me, Les, where was that love when you were destroying your sister's marriage? The same sister who actually raised you. She's the same sister who sacrificed most of her life for your sorry ass. What did she do to deserve this from you? Did you love her when you had her husband?" Leslie stared at him in horror. Even in her worst nightmares, it had never occurred to her that Kenny would publicly discuss their problems. But now she stood before him, and he was spewing their personal pain and betrayal in public. "Don't be deceived, Les. It wasn't me who did it, it was you. So tell me, Les, did you love me when you planned to let me quickly get you pregnant so you could get your fucking lover back in the saddle? What kind of sick bitch would call that love?" Leslie collapsed into an empty chair and sobbed. Soon her breath caught, and she began to choke. "Kenny, please," she wheezed. "I'm so sorry. Please." "I told you, Leslie, your apologies don't mean a damn thing. Besides, maybe making others question whether you're really the heartless monster I know you to be. But most of all, it baffles me how you could be so stupid as to think I would ever want to be with you again after all of this. Simply put, Leslie, it's not about you anymore. There isn't a damn thing you can say or do to even begin to make up for the damage you've done. There is no way to make up. There is no get it over with. I hope that knocking the piece off cost both marriages, because that is exactly what it cost everyone. We are gone. You killed us. So get over it." "No," she moaned. "We can fix this." "Just breathe, Leslie, before you faint and make another big scene." Kenny's face flashed with anger, but when he took a deep breath and looked at Leslie, his anger deepened. His gaze made her stop, and her huge eyes stared at him with painful understanding. "I've told you this before, and I'll keep telling you," he growled threateningly. "You can't love me anymore. Now." "Back off, you heartless whore," he wailed. Leslie was shocked by his fury at her. Any illusions she might have harbored were now gone. Their marriage was dead, and all that remained was the painful aftermath. Stunned, she stood up abruptly and, sobbing, ran out of the cafe. When she left, there was an eerie silence in the cafe. Kenny looked at Sam and saw her wide-open, stunned eyes. He immediately realized that all eyes in the cafe were on him, and his face flushed again. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That was very inappropriate of me." Sam's face contorted before she laughed. Her laughter was disarming and infectious. Soon Kenny saw smiles on the faces of many of the cafe's customers, and even felt a small smile budding on his own face. "Sir," she said, looking him in the eye, "you have nothing to apologize for. At best, you've caused more excitement than this place has seen in years." "That may be so, but I feel I owe your aunt an apology. Would you mind calling her?" he said, looking at the woman behind the counter. Sam's face froze as she suppressed another laugh. Finally, she pulled herself together. "Sure," she said, smiling broadly. "I'll go get Aunt Amanda. She's in the back and working on her books." She noticed Kenny's confused look. Nodding toward the smiling woman behind the counter, she explained, "This is Mrs. Hobbs. She and her husband were friends of my grandparents. They've been working here forever. Now I'm going to go get Aunt Amanda." Kenny sighed, watching Sam get up from the table and hurry back behind the counter. He stared into his coffee cup and tried to focus on what had just happened. He wondered how long this nightmare would go on. He realized what he'd done was cruel, but Leslie wasn't going to give up. He was done with this marriage and knew it was time to move on. It was like what he had told Leslie that night. He would start looking for someone to share his life with, and he would start looking soon. He was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't hear them approach his desk. Sam cleared her throat and turned his attention to the two women standing in front of him. "This," the girl smirked proudly, "is my Aunt Amanda." Kenny looked up and was stunned. There stood a short, pudgy adult replica of the attractive girl. Her raven-black curls fell to her shoulders, and the same green sparkle danced in her eyes. For a moment, he was stunned. Kenny stood up and stumbled to make his acquaintance. Both women joined him at the table, and Kenny began to apologize again. "Please," Amanda said warmly, "don't think about it anymore. Your apology is accepted, but it is not necessary. In fact, it reminded me of my last conversation with my ex-fiancé right before I came back here." Everyone laughed, and any tension or awkwardness quickly dissipated. Soon, Kenny and Amanda were already chatting casually with each other. Neither of them realized that they were now effectively ignoring Sam. Sam coughed again, and they stopped, then smiled embarrassedly. "Well," Sam said, leaning over to Kenny. She put her elbows on the table and covered her face with her hands. "Well, I wanted you to know that I lied to your wife. You're not that old, just experienced, and since I'm going to college soon, I can't wait to further my education. Maybe you can teach me a few things." Kenny choked on his coffee, and Sam smiled sweetly. Amanda arched an eyebrow, looking at her niece. "Well," Amanda murmured, "I've been out of college for a few years now, but I'm always interested in continuing my education." Kenny choked again, much to the delight of both women. He looked into two pairs of mischievous green eyes. "Samantha," Amanda said authoritatively, "I think Mrs. Hobbs could use a little help behind the counter." "Yeah, sure," Sam said, rolling her eyes. "All right, Auntie. I'll go take care of the customers, and you two sit and look at each other. Well, at least until he finally asks you out." "Sir, thank you and your lodge for the scholarship. You will not be disappointed." "By the way," she said, laughing as she left, "the cafe closes at 9. My aunt can leave before then, as she is the landlady." "A very young lady," Kenny said, smiling and shaking his head. "Yes, she is," Amanda grinned. "Someday she becomes a real handful. Well, okay, almost every day." They both chuckled before falling into an awkward silence. Amanda looked at Kenny and smiled warmly. "She's also very smart," she continued. "I usually leave at 9 o'clock at night." "Amanda," he said quietly, and his smile faded. "I'm going through a divorce right now." "Yeah, I thought I heard," she said, bursting into laughter. Her answer brought a smile back to Kenny's face. It was the first time he had ever smiled while talking about his impending divorce. "Listen," she said softly. "Why don't you come over some night when we close the store and we can sit and talk? I'll even give you a piece of pie and a cup of coffee. That way we can get to know each other a little better and maybe even become friends. And then, when your divorce becomes final, we'll see if it's worth moving on." He studied her in silence for a while, then smiled. There was someone special in front of him, someone he wanted to get to know better. I would like that. I would like that very much. The next month was surreal for Kenny. He accepted Amanda's offer and stopped by the cafe a couple days later. He was surprised at the comfortable conversation he had with this woman he had just met. They sat and talked, at first about general things, but soon began discussing their recent relationship failures. As Kenny described the collapse of his marriage, Amanda genuinely sympathized with him. She had seen her own engagement crash on the rocks when she decided to return home. Her ex-fiancé remained in Florida. Although she tried to continue the relationship, he decided he wasn't interested in a long-distance relationship and broke up with her. At first, Kenny stopped by there once or twice a week, but it soon turned into a regular night out. As he looked forward to talking to Amanda more and more, his pain and depression over his failed marriage became less and less. Kenny wasn't sure where his relationship with Amanda would go, but the hope of it seemed to heal his broken heart every day. Aside from going to the cafe, he continued to see Jill. She knew about Amanda and Sam even before he told her. Leslie had obviously been watching him and complaining about her fears and frustrations to her father, who in turn had told Jill. Jill thought it was karma. After kissing him, she told him that she was happy he'd found someone special to talk to. Kenny told her that he already had someone special to talk to, but it was nice to have two beautiful women to confide in. Jill blushed and hugged him tightly. When his divorce was finalized, he asked Amanda out on a real date. She accepted the invitation with a warm smile and invited him to her place for dinner Saturday night. Then he could ask her to the dance afterward. Kenny chuckled when he arrived at her house that evening. He had never been there before, but he immediately felt at home. Amanda and Sam's house was an old two-story farmhouse on a several-acre lot. It had a huge front yard and a large garden in the back. The old farmland had apparently been sold off as the property was now surrounded by new housing additions. The biggest smile on his face was the large terrace that wrapped around the house. It was definitely a family home. Karma, Kenny thought to himself and smiled. Epilogue. 6 years later. Kenny sat on the porch swing and watched a little black-haired girl play on the swings in the yard. He took a deep breath and smiled. What are you thinking about? A warm, soft voice behind him asked. Just reminiscing. He smiled. He was pleasantly surprised that he had been able to find peace so quickly after Leslie had ripped his heart out. Of course, his new wife had had a lot to do with it. He knew he had been one of the lucky few who had met a beautiful young woman during their divorces who ended up becoming his new wife. It was like a fantasy. Other things in his life were succeeding as well. Kenny's words were prophetic regarding Jill. Even before the divorce was final, she was getting calls from some guys asking her out. After the divorce, she had quite a few admirers. She eventually married a guy a few years older than her who turned out to be a bedbrother. He treats her like gold, and she is very happy. She has already given him 2 sons, and Bert is now an enthusiastic and loving grandfather. Bert, Jill, and her family have stayed close to Kenny and his wife. They even brought the kids to the farm at least once a month. No wonder none of them ever heard from Jerry again. Leslie hung around town for a couple years. She dated a few, but the stigma on her reputation caused most of them to classify her as a whore. Her relationship with her sister never recovered. Jill learned to be civil to Leslie, but they were never close again. Leslie's relationship with her father remained fairly strong, although he did not tolerate any of Leslie's self-pity. He also stopped any negative talk about Jill. Leslie still kept in frequent contact with him after she left town. Bert recently told Kenny that Leslie was trying to turn her life around. He said that she had started seriously dating a nice guy. Kenny thanked him and hoped that she had really changed. Secretly, Kenny doubted it, since it's hard for a leopard to change its spots. Nevertheless, hope seems to be eternal in the hearts of most parents. Kenny remembered how Bert had loved his daughters. He was battered and covered in bruises from past events, but he was still tough. Kenny realized this, now doubly so. He looked again at his 3-year-old daughter playing in the yard, and his heart filled with pride. He grinned to himself, remembering the same pride he'd felt 2 years ago when he'd walked his stepdaughter down the aisle. Sam was a stunning bride, and he found it hard to let go of her hand and give it to the young man standing next to her. The fact that her fiancé loved Sam as much as she loved him made it easier. He turned slowly and looked into his wife's concerned face. "Just remembering," he repeated softly. "The past is the past, but I think about it sometimes. It helps me remember how lucky I am now." "That's a good answer," Amanda murmured. She walked over to her husband and laid her pregnant body in his lap. Kenny instinctively put one arm around her and rested the other on her bulging tummy. Amanda leaned over and kissed him. He felt his heart beat harder as her kiss became more passionate. She sighed and laughed as they felt the baby kick. "Your son wants to meet his father," she whispered. "It won't be long now." Kenny squeezed her tightly as she clung to him even tighter. He smiled to himself, knowing he had found the woman who matched his only talent. They loved each other completely and had no fear of betrayal. It was without a doubt a small miracle. Sometimes there is a very high price to pay for happiness. Most of us are not willing to pay it up front. Fortunately or unfortunately, all debt must be paid off someday. Life goes on,